Good morning. How's everyone doing this morning? Or this afternoon, or lunchtime, depending on where you're tuning in. I just wanted to say welcome to the 2021 Breakthrough Dialogue. We also have about 150 remote guests that are joining us today from all over the country, the world. And that's the first time that this is the first type of conference we've ever thrown like that at Breakthrough. And it's very exciting. Because of that, you might see me trying to get us to start on time all the time. And that is because our virtual guests are dependent upon us starting. I don't usually do the introductions. My name is Thea. I am the Director of Events for Breakthrough. It's my great honor and pleasure to have been able to help throw this conference after the last year that we all faced. Here's the deal. People are in the room, people are out of the room. The people that are in this ballroom, you might find yourself darting your eyes up to the screen. I get to see one of the panelists right now in a monitor below me who is waiting in a virtual green room. There might be some technical issues. If there are, it means we're doing it right. This is what a hybrid event is. This is the first time we've done this, and I'm so excited. We should be very proud that this has all come together. And with that, I'm going to introduce our first plenary of the 2021 Breakthrough Dialogue, Ecomodern Justice for a Multipolar World. And the panelists will now come on stage. Thank you.
So is Alex not coming up right now?
No.
Okay. After you, Vij.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Nils Gilman. I work at a think tank in Los Angeles called the Berggruen Institute, and it's my great honor to be here today moderating this panel with three super interesting guests. We're going to have two people speaking in person, and then we're going to have a video presentation from Vivek, who's on the screen. You see him up here. And we'll get three presentations from them, and then we will have a little bit of a dialogue among the four of us afterwards, and then we'll have some Q&A from the audience. The focus of today's panel is about thinking about justice in a multipolar world. We'll have a number of different conversations about what development means, what technology sharing means, and in general, the different definitions of justice that are unfolding across the world, and how we might want to think about that in terms of the kinds of concerns for ecomodernism that we have here at Breakthrough. So I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time right before they each do their presentation, and I'm proud to introduce first Gyude, who's a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, and also the former Minister of Public Works in Liberia, and a keen observer and writer about African politics, economics, development, trade, foreign affairs, and so on. So Gyude, do you want to speak?
Thank you, Nils, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure being here with my colleague, Vij, even though Breakthrough is still away from us. And nice seeing you on the screen, Vivek. Hopefully, my comments, first in the introduction and then over the course of our discussion here today, will center on three points that I try to make on this question of justice. One is that I hope that my presence here sort of reflects the voices and opinion of people in a part of the world where I'm from. I think it's necessary that as these conversations happen, whether in private settings or in multilateral settings, that people from the parts of the world where I'm from will be represented there. The first thing is an increasingly complex the increasingly complex compromises that people who currently occupy the position I used to be in have to make, especially with dwindling resources. Right? The last survey that Afrobarometer did for 35 African countries in terms of the kinds of government they wanted to see, almost all of them, a majority of every country, said they wanted a more representative government. And so even in autocratic states, they still have sham elections for a veneer of legitimacy. And the primary responsibility of government is to provide security for its people, whether it's economic or physical security. What does economic security look like for the African continent? So that's one, that it is an increasingly complex environment in which they have to make these decisions. The second point that I want to make is that we seem to be talking past each other. And again, when I say Africa, it's important to make this clarification. When I say Africa here today, and for the rest of the time I'm speaking, I'm talking about the 48 countries south of the Sahara. So I just call them SSA 48. I have intentionally left South Africa out because South Africa's experience is completely different from the rest of the continent. South Africa is the only African country in the top 20 countries that are responsible for 80% of global emissions. And so because of that, we cannot speak of South Africa's experience as representative of Africa's experience. And for us in SSA 48, the conversation that we're having is about energy poverty. It is not about emissions reduction. Now, outside of Africa, in the West, maybe we should have the conversation about emissions reduction. But in Africa, that's not the conversation. And as long as we continue to have these two conversations separate, we're talking past each other. What do I mean by this? Our colleagues at the Energy for Growth Hub have taken this to an extreme, arguing that if the 48 countries south of the Sahara were to triple the energy use overnight using only natural gas, it would still be less than 1% of global emissions. Why are we having conversations about emissions reductions in a space like that? If we were to use per capita energy use, per capita energy consumption as a proxy for development, we would see that this is the least developed place in the world. When you take out the installed capacity in South Africa, all of the 48 countries south of the Sahara, the total installed capacity is 81 gigawatts. That's more than 20 gigawatts less than Spain with 60 people for 1 billion people. The question we should be having in Africa about justice is how we can increase the energy use across the continent so that our standard of living and quality of life can improve. One of the reasons why most African countries could not complete advanced commitment on vaccines was because they just didn't have the resources to be able to do that. And the reason they don't have the resources, as most people know, African countries largely export unprocessed raw material. Part of the reason we cannot process raw material is because of our low energy capacity. So on the question of energy use in Africa, for me, I think is about the role that natural gas plays in that transition. So there is a campaign underway now to defund all fossil fuels. And I think it's important to separate that. I'm not advocating for an expansion of coal plants or the use of heavy fuel. I'm talking about the role, the transitional role for natural gas in Africa's energy transition. The third point that I want to make, and I will return to this point again and again, is that for the SSA 48 and low-income countries, they should enter this negotiation with the West, from the assumption that our counterparts in the West are negotiating in bad faith. I know and I will try to clarify what I mean that our counterparts in the West are negotiating in bad faith. I was here last week, here in the San Francisco area, and because it's cold, it's hot in DC, I was remarking how cold it was here, especially because it's the summer. And everyone quoted Mark Twain to me, right? Supposedly the coldest winter I ever had was the summer in San Francisco. It turns out no one really knows Mark Twain actually said that. So if you want to say something and sound really, just attribute it to Mark Twain. So let's go with another Mark Twain saying. And this saying is that there is no education, there is no lesson in a second kick from a mule, right? For a long time, there was this assumption, this myth, and we believed it and repeated it without evidence, that if the world were to ever face a cataclysmic event, that we would rally together and respond to it. Well, until the coronavirus, we could continue to say that. But we have seen how abysmal the response of the world has been to the coronavirus. If the coronavirus had the same case fatality ratio as the Ebola virus that killed 88 to 90% of the people who caught it, it is my belief that the West would have watched us across the developed world die, perished in large numbers, and nothing would have happened. It is my view that on the question of the cataclysmic results of climate change, our Western counterparts are not going to change the behavior, that we're going to see the exact same behavior we're seeing in response to this. And so for us in the rest. For us, the SSA 48 and low-income countries, we enter this completely distrustful of our Western counterparts, that they're negotiating in bad faith. And this is why every Western country has gas in their plan for a transition. Every Western country, even today, the only reason Total is not extracting natural gas from Mozambique is because of the unrest in Cabo Delgado. But Japan, the United States, and Europe are investing in the extraction of natural gas for use in their economies, but they are advocating this campaign of reducing the financing of natural gas across Africa. I began by saying that my colleagues and people who are in the position I occupied before are faced with this complex environment of compromises. Almost 100% of energy markets across Africa are almost completely dependent on government financing. So when Europe and its allies in the United States completely cut off financing, either through bilateral or multilateral means, and then threaten the private sector of not being able to do that, it simply means that it is the development of Africa, the development of the poorest places in the world, the people least responsible for this. It is their development that we are sacrificing so that we can be able to face this crisis. And I think that is not only unseemly, it's unjust and absolutely unnecessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gyude. That was a powerful cri de coeur. I'd like to now introduce Vivek Maru, who's the CEO of Namati. Vivek is an American entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and human rights activist who's a pioneer in the field of legal empowerment. He founded Namati in 2011, 10 years ago, where he and Namati's partners have supported cadres of grassroots legal advocates in 10 countries. So welcome, Vivek, virtually to the Breakthrough Dialogue. We will now get a brief presentation, pre-recorded from Vivek, but we'll look forward to having him join us live in a few minutes. So roll tape.
Namaste. Climate politics. Climate politics. We usually think of it in terms of a sort of conflict between nation states. So, you know, China and India say to the United States and Europe, man, you guys got rich emitting. How are you going to get in our way now? And then the US and Europe say back to China and India, but you guys are so big. How are we going to solve this without you? And then you've got the small island states saying, we're sinking, damn it. You know, do you hear us? We're sinking. You guys know that whole story. The question I want to ask is, what happens if we change the frame, if we zoom in a little bit? And I'm thinking, for example, of the Mahabharata, which is one of the two great epics of India. I'm just going to share my screen, see how this works. Yeah, one of the two great epics of India, and people know it for this grand battle between these mighty forces. There was the 5 Pandav brothers and their army against the 100 Kaudav brothers and their army. But the stories that grip me the most in the Mahabharata is not that grand one, it's the smaller stories. For example, the story of Eklavya, who was a forest dweller. He was from a quote unquote low caste. He was from one of the communities that today the Indian government would classify as tribal. And he wanted to arch. That's what he wanted to do. And he approached the elite teacher, Drona, asking him for guidance and instruction. And Drona said, no, you get out of here. Drona's from a higher caste. He said, you get out of here. You go back to the forest. Eklavya didn't give up. He made a little statue of Drona, and he basically taught himself to arch in the forest so well that he could arch better than Arjuna, who was Drona's lead student and the hero of the epic overall. And when Drona, the teacher, found out about that, he asked Eklavya for his thumb so that Eklavya would never be able to arch again. And so that threat to the sort of excellence of that mighty power was neutralized. And what I want to know is what happened to Eklavya, and what does that whole story look like if you think about it from Eklavya's perspective? And the global environmental justice movement, which I consider myself to be a part of, we focus less on the conflict between nation states and more on communities, less on Kodavs versus Bandavs and more on people like Eklavya. And if you do that, if you zoom in that way and change the frame in that way, I see a lot of commonalities across the hemispheres. And I'll just name three trends that stand out that we see north, south, rich country, poor country, either which way. First, environmental harm is concentrated in communities with less wealth and less power. It is concentrated in communities who face discrimination, no matter where you are. Second, there are big, deadly gaps between environmental law on paper, on the one hand, and what happens in practice, on the other hand. I'm speaking to you guys from Washington, D.C., and I live near the Patuxent River, which flows through Maryland. There are over 100 facilities on the Patuxent River in open non-compliance with the Clean Water Act. You just go to the EPA website. This is on the company's own reporting, let alone what the companies are trying to hide. Here, for example, share my screen again, is a slide from the Comptroller General in India, who did an audit of over 350 firms, and they found really high rates of non-compliance with environmental conditions, rates as high as 57%. So that's another major trend that we see all over the place. A third one is that environmental destruction, it often results from concentration of power in the nation state and in corporations. We don't have a situation where the stakeholders sort of sit down in a circle and say, you know what, we're gonna pollute a little bit, but it's gonna be worth it because of the jobs we're gonna create and the electricity we're gonna be able to access. That is not what I see happening in practice. Instead, environmental destruction happens because of violations of communities' rights. And I'm just going to give you a few examples of what that looks like. I will start with my home place, the place where all my family comes from, which is called Kutch on the western coast of India. And in the last few decades, the fact that Kutch was poor, the fact that it was remote, was used to turn that place into a sacrifice zone. Today in southern Kutch, two of the biggest coal plants on the planet, 4,500 megawatts each, are across the street from each other in a little town in southern Kutch called Mundra. And those two are surrounded by a whole industrial zone with over 100 facilities, many of which are in flagrant violation of India's environmental regulations. And in southern Kutch today, the groundwater is severely depleted. There are many parts of Kutch today where it hurts to breathe. I'll give you another example. This is a neighborhood called Curtis Bay in Baltimore, the city of Baltimore in Maryland on the eastern United States. And what you see here in this picture in the background are open, uncovered coal piles. The coal is imported from or brought in by train from West Virginia and then put on ships and sent abroad to places like Gujarat, where Kutch is in India. And as you can see, the coal piles are across the street from a residential neighborhood, a basketball court, which is in this photo, a children's playground, a rec center. And it's not just the coal piles. Again, they are surrounded by a whole cluster of industrial facilities. This neighborhood has some of the highest asthma rates in the country. It's majority Black. It's another case where the destruction and the concentration of power, the inequality, those things are deeply tied. Just one more example, we work with communities in Eastern Sierra Leone and in a rainforest region of Eastern Sierra Leone who found out that all the land they have ever known, over 100,000 acres of forest, was signed away in a 50-year lease agreement to an oil palm plantation without anyone even asking them, without their consent whatsoever. And so these are the sorts of ways in which we see this connection between exploitation and inequality on the one hand and environmental destruction on the other hand. And we have found that on the other hand, when communities do have a greater say, when they are able to exercise their rights, you get outcomes that are both better for those people and involve greater environmental stewardship. And so therefore better for all of us. And our strategy for doing that, for ensuring that community rights are protected, is we work with what we sometimes call community paralegals, who are organizers, who are deeply rooted in the places that they are from, and who create kind of a bridge between the promises of formal law on the one hand and real life on the other hand. A decent analogy is the healthcare sector. You know, in healthcare, you wouldn't just rely on doctors to deliver healthcare. No way. We have a whole vertical network that includes midwives and community health workers and nurses. And we believe that we need the same for justice, that you can't just rely on a handful of lawyers who are expensive and elite and hard to understand, hard to access. Community paralegals are sort of the equivalent of community health workers. They create a front line for ensuring that those promises of law are actually accessible to ordinary people. And so we have worked with paralegals deeply in 5 countries and handled thousands. Those paralegals have supported communities to handle thousands, to address and take on thousands of violations of environmental law. Namati, the group that I work with, also convenes a global network of over 2,500 justice groups from over 170 countries. And, you know, we have found in doing this work that communities are often not saying no to development altogether. That's usually not what they're saying. They're just insisting on a say, on some voice and some decision-making power in terms of how development happens, for whom, on what terms. And so just to pick up the example I gave from Sierra Leone of the 100,000 acres of rainforest that was leased to an oil palm plantation, with the help of a couple of paralegals and a lawyer who was backing them up from Freetown, those communities were able to invalidate that lease that they had not consented to. But they didn't kick out the oil palm plantation. They actually said, you know, we would welcome some investment, but they reduced the size of the oil palm plantation to less than 1/10 of the original size. And they added social and environmental protections to that lease that weren't there before. They also tripled the rent payments that would be due to them. And so it wasn't no to development, but it was development with more stewardship. And when communities do that, when they stand up for themselves in that way, they are protecting all of us because they are stewarding resources that all of us ultimately depend upon. But instead of honoring their rights, instead of protecting them, we are often allowing people like that to face brutal retaliation. Paralegals we work with have been arrested for all kinds of trumped up charges, including trespass, disturbing the peace, even attempted murder, which was completely falsified. In a 3-week period in February and March, 3 indigenous leaders in the Peruvian Amazon who work with a member of our network called DAR, a Peruvian group called DAR, were murdered for resisting illegal deforestation. And there are many killings of that kind. There's a group called Global Witness that tracks killings of environmental defenders. The most recent data that's available is from 2019, and they found over 210 publicly reported killings of environmental defenders, never mind the ones that don't make the newspapers. And that 2019 figure was the highest that they had seen since they started tracking about a decade earlier. So in answer to this question of what climate justice means, I would say 3 things. One is confront that imbalance of power between the communities facing environmental harm and the state and corporations who are causing environmental harm. Number 2, democratize decision-making and enforcements, meaning give communities a meaningful role in deciding whether something's going to happen or not, if so, on what terms, and how those terms are going to be enforced. And then number 3, push the state, all of our nation states, to invest proactively in the work of transitioning to a more sustainable way of life, along the lines of what the Green New Deal proposals envision here in the United States. And I do see some steps, promising steps in the direction of reforms like these, what I would call kind of environmental justice reforms. In Sierra Leone, communities we work with across the country are organizing right now around 2 pieces of land legislation that we helped to draft, which would grant local communities the right to free prior informed consent over any project that happens on their territory, and any kind of project anywhere in the country. It would also empower land use committees and require that those committees be made up 50% of women. And that would be a deep democratization of environmental governance. The Escazú Agreement came into force in Latin America and the Caribbean on Earth Day this year, and it's the first international agreement to incorporate some of these basic environmental justice provisions, protections for environmental defenders, access to information about projects that are being proposed, and guaranteeing the right of communities' participation in environmental decisions. So those are some promising steps in the right direction. I think we need much more of that kind. If we are able to democratize decision-making in that way, we will create more equitable space for the crafting of alternative, less harmful ways of living. And I will close, just turn my slides back on. I'm gonna close with a quote that I love from an environmental justice organizer from California named Hop Hopkins. Hop says, let me see if I can get this to move. Hop says, you can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. In the Mahabharata, Drona, the teacher, and Arjun, the hero, they had concluded that Eklavya was disposable. And climate justice means harnessing the leadership of people like Eklavya rather than asking for their thumbs. Climate justice means ensuring that no community is disposable. Thank you, guys. I look forward to discussing.
That was great, Vivek. Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to Vijaya Ramachandran, who is a native daughter, as it were, of the Berggruen Institute. She's the Director of Energy and Development here, an economist whose research focuses on economic growth, private sector development, food security, and energy infrastructure, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Vijaya.
Thank you, Nils. Thank you, everyone. So I think my challenge is to sort of try to bring some unity, perhaps, to this discussion. Thank you, Vivek and Gyude, for your comments. I think here we have two very different sort of sets of issues around what climate justice means and what it means to address energy poverty and the lack of rights of groups of people who are harmed by the negative effects of the types of energy investments that we see in today's world. I think for us, the question is, what do we do? We're at a sort of crossroads where we have a set of countries, probably across the world, almost 2 billion people who don't have enough energy. They don't have electricity on a continuous basis. They don't have running water, which needs power. They don't have schools that are functioning. They don't have roads that are paved. A real set of sort of issues that keep communities poor. There's at least 2 billion people in that situation. And then there's the kinds of issues Vivek described, which arise from imbalance of power, from the lack of rights of certain groups, often minority groups or groups that are far-flung, where we are seeing the impacts of energy investments in a very negative way. I think trying to reconcile these two sets of issues is very difficult, and people tend to sort of fall into one camp or the other. I hope we can reframe the conversation to think about kind of what can we do to address both energy poverty and these kinds of issues surrounding the lack of rights. I think there's 3 or 4 things we can do. One is we have to give more flexibility to poor countries, and this is the point that Gyude made earlier. We have to give low-emitting poor countries more flexibility in terms of making decisions around the energy sector. There are no high-emitting, low-income countries. That doesn't exist. So I think we need to think about countries like that and what it means to be very, very poor and have a total lack of access to energy. For those sorts of countries, we do need to put natural gas on the table. We do need to think about fuels that are transitional fuels that might burn cleaner than coal, but may not be as clean as wind or solar and so on. That is not something we can take off the table right now. Africa is sitting on 600 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. A third of that is in Nigeria. telling Africans now that they can only do renewables is not going to address energy poverty. It's not going to improve the rights of anybody. And it's not going to make people better off or more well off. I mean, I think one of the issues that's been raised in both of these sets of comments is the fact that lack of rights is related to lack of income. And it is largely poor communities that face harm. It's largely poor communities that are fighting for, better forms of energy or cleaner forms of energy. One of the ways we can make communities richer is by investing in energy. And I think that point sort of gets forgotten. To build energy access is to improve climate resilience, is to improve incomes, which in turn will create stronger civil societies and better rights, perhaps, or better access to the kinds of power that Vivek is describing in his comments. The other thing I think that we can do in rich countries is to invest in R&D. Alex Trembath had a really nice essay about this. One of the most important things the US can do is invest in technologies that will help us to reduce the costs of cleaner forms of energy. We can't simply sort of order poor countries to do clean energy only. We have to make these investments in technology. If we want things that burn cleaner than coal, we're going to have to do our bit to make that possible. We're a very, very long ways away from getting most poor countries to invest in the kinds of renewable technologies that exist today. Most of them are not really viable for poor countries. And so I think there, the US can play a really important role, and through its role in organizations like the World Bank, it can really encourage investment in R&D, investment in adaptation of existing R&D for poor countries, keeping in mind that the ownership of energy resources in poor countries is largely not in the private sector. 60% of energy companies in poor countries are state-owned. So the big fossil fuel companies that we think about, when we think about fossil fuels, we think about ExxonMobil, but Indian fossil fuels are largely owned by the state. And India Coal employs 4 million people. It is a public sector company. So I think we need to understand that as well. What are the kinds of ownership systems that exist in poor countries, and how can we best assist these kinds of companies to transition? And those are a very different set of challenges than what we might see kind of in the US. And one final point on the rights issues, I don't think those are going to go away with renewables. I think we need to be very realistic about that. As we transition from coal and from oil to natural gas and then on to wind and solar, I think we will see issues around land use and land rights, around various things dealing with waste, around human rights issues, the manufacture of polysilicon for solar panels, largely in Xinjiang, which is a serious set of human rights issues. So I think those kinds of issues are ongoing. I don't want to give people the impression that if we can move away from fossil fuels, we can also then automatically get to a situation where rights are improving. They may not for a very long time. I think that is sort of the reality of the situation and what's emerging as we see data on these issues. But with that, I think, Nils, I'll turn it back to you, and hopefully we can sort of have an interesting discussion around these points.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Vijaya. Thank you, all three of you.
Good job, Vic.
Vivek, I want to just start by commenting on your presentation, which is that this allegory that you talk about the cutting off one's own thumb, reminded me of something that's not a particularly well-known story, at least not in the West. I'm sure it's quite well-known in India and in Bengal in particular, which is one of the ways in which the British accelerated the exports of textiles to India. India was the biggest textile-producing country in the world in the early 19th century. And the way the Brits were busy industrializing on the basis of textiles in the early 19th century, the way they entered the Bengali market and the Indian market was by cutting off the thumbs of some 10,000 textile workers in Bengal. Yeah. This was a literal act. Yeah. I bring that up partly because this is a story that's not particularly well known in the West. I'm sure it is known in India notoriously. But it also brings up the issue of temporality, which I want to put as a question to each of you, which is that one of the stories in the claims that some people make that we need to move to a straight green energy transition in Africa, for example, is that always ignores the fact that 98%, 95% of the emissions that have currently been put into the air have been done by the industrial West. China has recently become the biggest emitter in the world, but even China, if you think about who's consuming the goods that are being produced in China, the West is responsible for a great deal of those emissions as well. And so one of the things I want to ask all three of you is thinking about the sort of temporal obligations. And how do we, in particular, make Westerners feel that temporal obligation? The way in which Britain became the biggest industrial powerhouse of the 19th century was by literally chopping off the thumbs of Bengali textile workers. And that's how they became the industrial powerhouse that then has polluted the world. How do we communicate that kind of historical legacy of responsibility in a way that can be compelling to make people understand that therefore there are obligations, that we need to help the technology transitions, that there needs to be a positive investment by the West, by the United States, by Western Europe in technologies which can help this transitional period. How do we communicate that point? I put that to all three of you. Maybe I'll start with Vivek since I jumped off of your presentation.
I want to, before I start, you guys can hear me all right?
Yeah.
I just apologize that those recorded remarks kind of took more than my share of the time, and I was laughing about how I was saying on the one hand, on the other hand, I want to confess, guys, I really only have two hands. Just that much. But temporal obligation, I mean, I think it probably goes without saying with you guys sitting in California, that the cutting of thumbs wasn't just a transnational phenomenon, that for example, the U.S. wealth and the industrial power that both made this country rich and dominant, and also created an outsized share of the emissions that led to the climate crisis, that was built on slavery, on genocide of Native Americans. And so a big story that I think is important and under considered when we talk about climate politics as this sort of debate between nation states is that the inequality and the sacrificing that has happened everywhere. And so what I would love to see in the conversation and the sort of movement that I would like to be a part of growing is one of ordinary people facing environmental harm, which is increasingly more and more of us across the globe, challenging the concentration of power that has been a part of how decisions have made. And so a lot of what I'm offering, it's not necessarily to disagree with the sort of narrow argument about natural gas as a bridge fuel in Africa. A lot of what I'm offering is more of you might say, a process point about who's making the decisions, who's making the choices about what energy mix makes sense, what form of development makes sense. And I think those decisions have been made by too few for too long in North and South countries alike. And so that's what I would love to see shift.
Gyude, how do you think about this, especially given the fact that, as you say, the presumption of bad faith on the part of the people negotiating, both at the macro level that you were talking about, the nation state level, but also to Vivek's point, similar kinds of bad faith happening at local negotiation levels?
Yeah, I think first, if we go back to '92 at the first conference, when the world first, acknowledges that climate change is driven by human action in '92, the UN conference, there were two principles that were acknowledged at the time, and what we're seeing now is a departure from those. The first was a collective but differentiated responsibility. That this was something driven by human action, but certain people were more responsible than others. The second was the polluters pay. Right? Those who are more responsible will bear the cost. And it appears now that we're finally beginning to realize what the cost of the transition is. We're stepping away from that. So first, I think what we're doing here, this conversation that we're having, is a part of that, of being able to change and drive narrative. I think that the final point that I will add here, though, is that outside of Africa and I think parts of Asia, but I would like to again focus on SSA 48, that the median age is 19. It is the youngest and fastest growing population in the world. Everywhere else, population has either stabilized or is below replacement levels. And at some point, this is going to come to head. And so it is actually self-interested for the West and Europe to begin to think of those places in terms of what would drive the economy of the future. Because Japan is one of the most technologically advanced places in the world, but even then, Japan is actually beginning to face the consequences of aging, and those consequences are going to be widespread in time. South Korea in the last year, I think, was 9.85% instead of 2.1%. And so that is going to have an effect everywhere else. So maybe if we can tell a story, if we can reframe this narrative so that people see it as, you're not helping people elsewhere, you're being selfish and helping yourself, maybe that will help to shift it.
Vijaya, you agree with that? We just need to appeal to people's selfishness, or is there something else?
Well, I mean, on that point, I think it's worth reminding everybody. Germany opened a new coal plant this year. It has been bargaining for Nord Stream 2 to come online, so it can, because its demand for liquefied natural gas is so high. Belgium is bringing a natural gas plant online this year. There's the East Med supply line, which the US is promoting to, again, bring natural gas from other countries into Europe. So I think it's worth reminding European countries, reminding the US that we are very reliant on these fuels. These are not changing. These demands are changing slowly, and it's not fair to tell poor countries, you have to stop right now while we're continuing to add capacity, particularly in natural gas. I think that point is sort of worth making. I think it's also worth reminding everybody that leapfrogging is not a thing. It doesn't really exist. And everybody has to transition in some way or the other. And some countries will have different paths than others. I think that needs to be sort of recognized as well. And in the end, I think we do have to make the case for economic development. That countries being richer and being able to manage their own lives and improve their bargaining power depends on the investments in modern industrialization. It depends on investments in improving agricultural productivity. And it's not in anybody's interest to keep poor countries poor. They're less able to cope with disease when it hits. We're seeing that right now. So I think we can make a case, a self-interest case, and in some ways, I think we have to make a self-interest case, kind of just given how geopolitics are these days.
Let me shift gears a little bit and talk about, try to compare, I guess, the question of power dynamics that was central to Vivek's presentation. And the question is, so Vivek has been doing all this very interesting work about trying to empower local communities in the face of state actions or large corporate actions, and this is at a local level. How do we, and some of these things, obviously there's been backlash in tragic ways, as you were describing from the Peruvian situation, and there's been many other examples of environmental activists and legal proponents of indigenous rights and environmental rights being the victims of violence and murder. How do we think about changing the power dynamics, not just at these local levels, and there's always resistance from the people who have power to that, but also at the national level? So it's one thing, Gyude, to say, and I think you're right, to go in with the assumption of bad faith, but how do you actually change that?
So I have two suggestions. One is I'm basically repeating a point that Tony Blair made in 2019 when he tried to argue for the UK to remain in the European Union. And the way he saw it was that globally, geopolitics was arranged by, he called these, it was dominated by what he called continent-sized countries. So you have the United States, you have China, you have India. They're single countries, but they're the size of a continent. And the European Union, by pooling their sovereignty, created another continent-sized unit. And so his argument was that for Britain to be able to have any influence, because what it means when you sit at a table with continent-sized countries to discuss, and then below those are what he called the tall countries. And the tall countries he was talking about, your Brazil, your Indonesia, your Nigeria, we're talking over 150 million people. So he was saying that for Britain to retain any power in this system, was that it had to align itself with one of these units, and so making a case for you. And I think that's what's beginning to happen in Africa, though. With the coming into effect of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, what we're trying to do is to pull the 55 countries on the continent into a single unit and increase our leverage vis-a-vis the world as we negotiate with them. And so I think first that is an important part, that 54 or 55, depending on who's counting, balkanized states, really, really small, are not going to have that kind of effect. But if the entire continent, I keep making this argument that Africa's prosperity is in the is as a unit, that there is no path, there's no viable path to prosperity on that continent outside the unit. And so I think that's a very, very important part of that. So that's the first one in terms of being able to create our strength. The second one is, create new power sources. I think today, if you listen to American and European policymakers, what are they terrified of? The rise of China. And most times that conversation has been presented as if it is an unmitigated disaster. But in the poorest places in the world, the rise of China has actually meant a shift in the power dynamics of the relationship. The first time I heard about this, I was a graduate student in the mid-2000s and heard the former president of Senegal, Abdoulaye Wade, at an event at the Cato Institute. I was then at Georgetown, and I went to the event. And he said that for us Africans, over the last 2 decades, if we wanted to do anything, we were restricted to going to Brussels, to London, or Washington. By putting Beijing on the table, it's increased our leverage. And so I think as long as China remains a viable source of financing, it will shift the conversation, because if Europe and the United States continue to be as hypocritical as they are in this transition, then for the smallest countries in the world, it makes sense to turn to China, regardless of what Chinese politics might be. So I think one of the ways that we change that leverage is just increasing the power sources on the table.
I want to get back to China in a little bit, because I think this is a really important topic, but I want to let Vijaya respond to this as well.
So I think the other point of leverage is India. India has been the holdout this whole time. India is really pushing back on this imposition of renewables only by the rich countries on poor countries. India refused to a timeline to phase out coal at the G20 meeting in Naples last week, and insisted that the communique not contain any information about a concrete timeline for them. It also failed to show up at the COP26 ministerial meeting in London, and it was the only one of the 51 countries invited that didn't show up. I think India has significant clout to reshape this conversation. If it signals that poor countries need a voice and they need to be able to determine their paths to phasing out fossil fuels, and they need to be heard and not be told what to do, rich countries won't have any other choice but to listen. I mean, India is now the second largest producer of coal. They have to bring India to the table. And so I think there is leverage there, there's bargaining power there. I think India is becoming increasingly concerned, and for its own geopolitical purposes, very interested in becoming an ally to many African countries. And so there is sort of a uniting of positions along that axis. And maybe that can shape, the rebalance away from what's happening now, where the US, I think in order to please its domestic constituencies, is imposing these blanket bans through the World Bank and others. I mean, if there's any counter to this, it may come in the form of what the Indians do.
So let me, Vivek, did you want to comment on any of on this?
Just that I think an important pathway for countering the imbalance of power between nations is to reckon with the imbalance of power within nations and the imperialism within countries. I mean, to take Liberia, for example, until the Land Rights Act of 2018, the Liberian government claimed ownership of almost all the land in the country. And it had, by that point, issued concessions for 40% of the landmass of the country without the consent of the people who live and depend on those lands. In India, the Forest Rights Act in 2006, until then, the Indian government claimed full dominion over forest areas, which was continuing the British policy of disenfranchising tribal people. Same story here in the United States. And I think in terms of not honoring the rights of indigenous peoples or local communities in general here in the United States. In fact, it was the Obama administration that watered down the sort of free, prior, informed consent principle in the International Convention on Indigenous People. So I think that would be, and I hope I'm not beating the horse too many times. That would be my core emphasis, that we got to reckon with the imperialism that we have inside each of these places.
So I want to go back to the China question that you raised, Gyude. So I understand the countervailing powers is a way of getting leverage, particularly for smaller powers. And you also think that Africa coming together, collective bargaining is another way to generate strength from if you have a scattered group of relatively weak bargainers, if they can collectively bargain, that actually can bring their strength together. Mm-hmm. I'm also concerned, though, that as we think about China and India in particular as countervailing forces that can create bargaining leverage for Africa, these are also countries that they're superpowers in their own right. Yeah. They have a strong rivalry with one another, to put it mildly. Yeah. They have had quasi-wars as recently as last year. And I worry that the geopolitical rivalries will, in the end, overcome the concern for these sort of planetary limits that we're running up against, and that at the end of the day, the search for power on the geopolitical stage will trump the kinds of concerns that we've been focused on in this conversation. How do we think about getting past that? And so yes, China has done a tremendous amount in terms of developing African infrastructure for creating leverage so that Africa is not dependent only on London, Brussels, or Washington, and yet China has its own interests, and environmental ones haven't seemed to be high on their list historically in the last 40 years.
Who goes first?
Go ahead.
I just quickly wanted to just respond to something Vivek said, and I think this is true, that I teach a class on the role of infrastructure in foreign policy, and one of the first things that we read is Mao's The Gift, where there are no free gifts. But the nation state itself, the process of the creation of the nation state, is a violent one. In fact, state failure or state success is basically the monopoly over the use of violence within its borders, right? And so a state that no longer controls the monopoly of violence within its borders is considered failed. So I think the question Vivek asked goes beyond this. It's about, what exactly it means for us to be able to create states and maintain them. But states have resisted any infringement on the perks that occur to them simply by being nation states. So I think that's a very important question. On this issue, and it comes back to the gift, there are no free gifts, right? No free lunches. It may appear free, there's always some kind of thread connected to it. China's presence in Africa is not altruistic. Neither is Europe's presence in Africa altruistic, right? Every single country, the primary goal, the primary objective of the state is its survival. And out of the survival of the state comes the entire thing we call national security. Every state's behavior in the international system is driven by this, what it defines as its national security. And so for African countries, I think we recognize this. We know this. I gave you a couple of examples that every time there was a vote at the United Nations, we would get a call or a visit from the Chinese ambassador if this were a position that the Chinese ambassador wanted Liberia to vote with them on. Well, we would get that. And, there were two requests that are made. One is vote yes or no, whatever the Chinese position is, or abstain, right? So that whatever that position, it doesn't get as much votes as it would be. Well, the only reason they can make that demand is, China has built us a massive hospital in the middle of the country, a referral hospital. They built a massive university campus for our students. Chinese companies were investing in our mines and creating jobs in Liberia. It gives China leverage in negotiating with us. But there is nothing unusual or unique with China doing that. The United States and Europe, they do the exact same thing. And so I see a point that eventually in this sort of struggle on our part to create new loci of power might end up, overtaking what we're trying to do. But it's not as if it's static and sterile. just because we don't do it doesn't mean these great power competitions are going to happen anyway. And so we're at a disadvantage anyway. So if we can obtain any kind of benefit from this, and that's just the foreign policy maker in me talking, we're going to go ahead and do that. And that's the advice that I would give to people who currently occupy the position that I once did. And if I'm in a position to advise presidents, I'll tell them the same thing.
Vijaya?
So I'll address your latter point, which is sort of this planetary limits issue. You know, many African countries are majority renewables already. It's not like they're resisting this transition or thinking about it in terms of being locked into the sort of to fossil fuels or anything like that. I mean, we've seen a huge increase in hydro, in geothermal, in solar across the continent. And I think as prices shift, we'll start to see more of that. I don't see this as a lock-in. I think that if people are thinking about this strategically on the continent as they are, they will be able to leverage resources from China and India to pursue renewables and to transition, but to sort of transition in each of their own unique ways. I think that's the part that we have to recognize, and that we have to recognize that natural gas is going to be a very big part of that transition for some time. I mean, nobody in Africa outside of South Africa is really thinking about investing resources in coal. This is really about transitioning via natural gas. And I think for the Western powers, thinking about this more reasonably will perhaps reduce sort of these tensions around, what Africa is going to do and how to kind of, I think we need to move away from forcing them to do certain things to kind of helping them do the path that they're already on in most cases.
Yeah, I think a really important point that is implicit in what all three of you have been saying is that there's not a single model.
Yeah.
And certainly there's not a single model that was, the China model or the American model. These are irrelevant to the challenges facing a Liberia or a Sierra Leone or frankly in India for that matter. I want to ask a different question to you, Vivek, in relation to this issue of countervailing great powers, particularly in places like Africa, but also Latin America. How has the arrival, let's say, of China in particular, and maybe prospectively soon India as well, in these local theaters, changed the kinds of power dynamics that happen that you've been addressing in your work at Namati? Has it, there are almost always with these powerful local actors, they're almost always in some kind of political arrangement with outside powers. And how does the pluralization of those outside powers change the kinds of dynamics that you're addressing in your work?
It's a great question. Gyude, you mentioned that, sort of feels the same to you, like the way China was calling you about those UN decisions, not that different from what the American and European powers have done. And I would agree. There's lots of commonalities between the various sources of investment and how things end up playing out at a community level. I would say, from our experience, that the role of Chinese investment and Indian investment in Africa, for what it's worth, has been more opaque, and the pathway to accountability has been tougher. There's a case right now involving Black Johnson Beach in Sierra Leone, for example, where the Chinese government gave a $20 million grant to build a fish meal plant, and to the Sierra Leone government, and there was no environmental impact assessment, no notification of the communities who live there. This is like one of the most kind of precious ecological places in the country, and I think that it's the opacity that has been a real challenge from the way the Chinese have operated. We're excited, I should say, I'm interested in the rights of people everywhere, and Chinese people have suffered so much from Chinese authoritarianism. It sort of goes without saying. And so part of what we're interested in is greater solidarity and allyship between grassroots justice efforts in China, which do exist despite the extreme repression on the one hand, and grassroots justice efforts elsewhere. And we've had help actually from very courageous activists within China who are seeking accountability of firms both at home and abroad. So that part of that part of what I hope for in the future is greater solidarity and partnership across borders among ordinary people.
Gyude, how do you think about this point that Vivek is making concerning transparency and the importance of transparency, particularly in Africa? Because this has been a recurring critique of things that go on in Africa, first with Western investments and now with China.
Yeah, I think the commonalities notwithstanding, there are clear differences in how, say, Chinese firms conduct business and how European firms or American firms do. First, for American firms, there's a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There was a case out of India, Vij, where local communities sued the IFC.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
right.
the case. Yeah.
Exactly.
I was involved in that case.
And those, so in those systems, there's recourse for communities, right? I've never heard of a community suing a Chinese company at a court in Beijing.
Yeah, good luck with that.
So I don't think that there's a path there. And so the second thing also, and this is a question that's come up again and again, I have argued that Chinese investment in African infrastructure has, for the most part, been a net positive. And I've said again that I don't know if I'm going to say that in 10 years, but for now, yes. But one of the things that I have raised and others have is just the opaque nature of these deals. Some of our colleagues at the Center for Global Development just reviewed over 125 Chinese contracts. And one of the things they found was that China insists on secrecy around these. Well, this is a loan. Most likely the country, the government in power that is negotiating the loan is not going to be in power when the country repays the loan. It is important that people understand what the terms are. And so I think all of these accusations of debt trap diplomacy came out of all of this secrecy. So I think that is an issue there. What I will say, though, is that they were able to see 125 contracts because those countries have rules that say if they negotiate any contract, those contracts have to be made public. And in instances where the national law demanded it, the Chinese didn't go against it. So they have this saying in business, you don't usually get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. So I think it is important that governments, whether big or small, in the relationship, try to push this. And if you have national laws, I don't think the Chinese or anyone else is going to openly contravene those laws.
Vijaya?
Yeah, so one point on that, and maybe not for the best reasons, but China's the flows into Africa went net negative in 2019.
That's correct.
So the debt payments are now concentrated in 5 or 6 countries, but nonetheless, the debt payments are now exceeding the investments going into Africa. The series of problems that have arisen around debt prepayment has ironically resulted also in some increase in transparency. Mm-hmm. So I think as we get into the next generation of Chinese lending and Chinese activity in Africa, there will be pressure on all sides, particularly within Africa, from civil society, from maybe even from some parts of government itself, to be more transparent about these deals, because some of these loan payments are becoming extremely burdensome. So I think everyone's sort of waking up to the fact that this is not a free lunch, and that I think everyone has to be more careful going forward.
Great. Well, thank you all three of you. I want to open up to questions from the audience now, and I think we're going to be getting questions in 2 sorts, right? We're going to be getting questions from all of you here who are present, but I think we may also be getting questions online technically.
Well, we'll start with questions from the room.
Okay, great.
Great.
It's not exactly a question, but also a little bit of comment. So one thing is that I feel that thinking of China or balancing of power through some others is like, throwing someone from frying pan to the fire. Right? So I would not go that way. So maybe what we really need to do is more self-reflection. I would ask you that if I ask you to reflect on how China is what China is today, how US is today, and how did it grow? And if you look back into this history, right, where India is today, how it grew, right? So Europe. So if you just look back, it was the investment in their own capacity, their own decision-making power, empowering their own people who could make the decision. So why we are not looking into that development model, which actually is a common thread in all, And then why are we not empowering the Africa to take their decision what they want the development to be? That will take maybe, so we have spent so many years trying out all different models, experimenting with these South Asian, East Asian, Myanmar. Look at Myanmar, what is happening now. So rich in resource. If you go to the country, you will feel that people are so intelligent, they have so much of resource. It's just not the right investment decisions. So how do we come up with that? How do we empower, build the self-confidence of people? And that's how whole world is today where they are, right? So why we are not looking into that and trying something else which we do not know? So that will be my question.
All right. Any of you want to respond?
I 100% agree. I actually have a column in Africa Business that came out today, and the argument I make is that no rule taker has ever improved their lot by continuing to take the rules as they are. And that, maybe it's time that African countries actually begin to look inward for an answer to the issue. But I think there is a paper that Vij wrote and talked about this, that the path for all the countries you talked about was productivity in agriculture, the excess labor moves into manufacturing, and for some reason, that has not happened in Africa in terms of, so today, over 50% of the labor force of the continent is still in agriculture, but that agriculture is still subsistence. It's not very productive. And so how can we, I think the first place we would look as Africans would be, if we can create a more productive agricultural sector, we will be on our way to being able to make the kinds of developments that you're talking about. But I agree with you that, looking externally for answers, having worked since 1945, I'm not sure it's going to work.
I would just add one of the key things in order to improve the agricultural productivity is an energy transition.
That's right.
So that's a huge part of the story.
No, exactly. And I think also, Joyshri, to speak to your point, I feel like a lot of the aid that has gone to poor countries has not focused on building local capacity or even state capacity. There's sort of a set of perverse incentives inside these institutions to disperse loans and get things done. And the idea of sort of creating space for countries to figure this out themselves simply doesn't exist. You're on fiscal year deadlines, you're looking at career promotions, there's all these sort of incentives inside these institutions. So I think in the decades and decades that we've seen, foreign aid sent to Africa, we have not seen a lot of investments by actors. And I think we need to call out, we need to kind of call that out when we can and get these institutions to think more about how they might actually build some local capacity so they're not in business in perpetuity, which often seems like that seems to be what the goal is rather than, building development inside.
Vivek, do you think of what you do as capacity building in some way?
I do, yeah. I think, sort of law is our starting point, and the law historically has been so dominated by elites, and the power of law has been wielded by elites. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is demystify and democratize law and equip ordinary people to know, use, shape. That's our mantra. It's like everybody should be able to do those three things: to understand what the law says, to use it to address a problem they face, and ultimately to shape it.
Other questions or comments from the audience here?
Hello, thank you for this discussion today. My name is Jason Swan, and I just, I always think about education equity, if anything. And I always, in my community, we talk about education being the catalyst in which, personal and systemic transformation creates more equitable outcomes for everyone. And so on a more grassroots level, I'm very curious to see, what has been done, because all of us are, I feel, really going through the subjects, really privileged to be able to have that opportunity to be able to educate ourselves and know what's happening on the ground and around the world. How are we creating or replicating the information that we know on the ground in your perspective fields of expertise?
We haven't really talked about education, it's true. What do you guys think?
Ricardo Hausman and a co-author did this thing on sort of the complexity index, how complex an economy is. And one of the arguments they make is that countries are not rich because of what they have, they're rich because of what they know. It's almost impossible to me. I mean, almost all of the natural resources we're talking about they're expendable, they're finite, and at some point they're gonna be gone. But if we can invest in people, actually invest in human capital, and unfortunately, again, you know, that the ability to invest in human capital, I think on every measure of human capital, Africa lags behind. And so, you know, as we tend to focus on this, maybe what is necessary, there was a speech last week by the Ghanaian president where he was saying that, you know, for years, Africa has not been respected by the world, no one takes us seriously. And I responded in a tweet and said, well, maybe we should just invest in the African people. The results will be respected by all. And the way you invest in people is invest in healthcare, is invest in education. And eventually we're gonna be able to see the outcomes that we want. I think this is a big part of what is missing. But we still have to address the energy question. 500 million Africans, the number goes up from 520 to 720 million people without access to electricity. What do you do with the schools? What, you shut the schools down if it gets dark outside? You know, what do you do with hospitals where people cannot treat patients once daylight goes off and there's no electricity to be able to do that? How do you store vaccines? The way we invest in human capital, especially on health and education, is again, in terms of the basic infrastructure that we put in place to be able to support that.
Great.
Other questions? I'm going to take, because this is a sort of, I think, going to have to be our last round. So I want to take a couple, and then we'll go back to the panel to respond and wrap up.
Thank you so much for the discussion so far. My name is Jonah Messinger. So my question is, there's a lot of discussion about sort of domestic natural gas resources in sub-Saharan Africa and the need to develop those resources. And I'm wondering, you know, what folks think for sub-Saharan governments and leaders, you know, how to balance, on the one hand, the need to bring in perhaps, you know, foreign firms, Chinese or otherwise, that have the technical expertise to really develop those resources properly, but at the same time ensuring that there's sufficient domestic use and consumption of those resources, and then it's not sort of a resource extraction paradigm. And then the other thing is, you know, Vij, you were sort of discussing about how, you know, Western finance institutions and development banks are, you know, increasingly not only resisting coal development, but also natural gas development itself. But I'm also struck that at the same time, there's also seems to be hesitancy in funding large hydro projects as well. And so, you know, if you can't develop a large renewable project either, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay.
That's a question here too, yeah.
Let's take, if there's other questions. Good.
Hi, I just wanted to make one quick reply. Vivek made this great point about we need to deal with the imperialism that is happening within countries. And the last few years, I've done a lot of work on land use, and this is the key issue with renewables. And I think it's, frankly, time to debunk this halo around the idea of renewables and the Green New Deal, that suddenly this is going to result in equitable jobs and so on for people all over the world. Well, the reality is, and I published a report with the Center of the American Experiment in April, more than 300 communities from Maine to Hawaii in the United States since 2015 have rejected or restricted wind projects. Now, you don't read about this in big media outlets, but this is the reality. In New York State, wind projects are so unpopular that the state has passed a law that will effectively allow the state to override local community zoning if those zoning rules conflict with the state's climate change goals. So, and this idea of imperialism, what's happening in New York? Wind projects are being sited in the poorest counties in the state. Allegheny and Cattaraugus counties are the third and fourth, memory serves, or fourth and fifth poorest counties in New York. There's no wind projects being sited in Westchester. These projects are not being put into wealthy counties or wealthy communities. They wouldn't stand for it. So what is happening is then what happened, Invenergy, one of the biggest privately held wind companies in America, sued the local county. In Iowa, Madison County, Iowa, famous for its wooden bridges, was passed an ordinance in December prohibiting wind projects. What happened? The next month, Mid-American Energy, a subsidiary of Berkshire Hathaway, one of the largest corporations in America, sued Madison County, Iowa. So this idea that, final point, if the oil and gas industry was doing this, was acting like this, it would be front page news. But because it's the wind and solar industries, this halo effect around renewables, it doesn't get reported on by big media outlets. But I think fundamentally, whether it's Africa, India, elsewhere, all of these energy projects are about land use and local control and the extent to which local communities are going to be able to determine what is built in their communities. So I thought Vivek's point was really important, and you can see this power dynamic at play when it comes to renewable siting here in America.
Do we want to allow the panel to respond to those questions? Yes, and then we'll take some more.
I think this is probably our last.
This is it?
I think we got to wrap it, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gyude, go ahead, and then I'll go next.
So there is something, the African Union has something called PITA, and it's just a compilation of all infrastructure. It's the Program of Infrastructure Development in Africa. You can go to the website. Almost all of the projects on there are hydro projects, and very few of them have attracted any kind of funding. When the West says renewables, there's a very clear idea of what renewables are and what it means. And there's also, there's this sort of a slew of options that are available, and there's nothing else outside of those options. And I think that's what we're trying to, the conversation that we're having, and when I make these comments is about, like Vish said, most African countries are dedicated to, I think Kenya has the largest geothermal across the continent, and Kenya continues to invest in geothermal. Togo is putting up almost $400 million worth of solar panels. That the project just got kicked off the other day. A lot of African countries are going in that direction. The idea isn't that we want to get stuck in coal and that. South Africa accounts for 95% of coal use on the continent. And so, like I said, South Africa is a completely different story. What we're asking, what the argument we're making is that countries, especially the poorest countries in the world, for whom the question is not reduction in emissions, but actually addressing energy poverty, are given the options of being able to do that. And on the question of communities, yeah, I think so. I think Vivek's point is really, really right, that power is power. It doesn't matter if the power is being wielded by a coal company or a renewable energy company. Power always, like Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. And power's ultimate goal is maximization of even more power and influence. So yeah, we expect to see this, whether it's from renewables or from fossil fuels.
Yeah, I think I'll end by saying, this transition is going to be very messy. I think there's no easy answer. Certainly, I think we need to not put halos on anything, including renewables. I think it's going to be incredibly hard to transition workers from the coal sector into installing solar panels. I'm not seeing any easy path to doing that. I think the land issues are going to be really complicated, especially sort of exacerbated by these sort of unequal bargaining power relationships. So, I think we need to have a very realistic sense of what this is going to be to transition to a less carbon-intensive world. And I think we need to recognize that for very poor countries, this is going to be different paths. It's going to be more complicated in many ways. And the international community, I think, has to show a lot more patience and understanding of what's going on in those countries than I think the current situation reflects.
And generosity, I would add.
Yes.
Final word.
I was just thinking, a risk of this conversation would be that we are talking past each other, that Gyude is sort of speaking the language nation states, and I'm sort of talking about communities, and they kind of, the twains don't meet. It's sort of like disconnected. And I guess I would just, my closing reflection would be that that's not true, that these two stories are deeply connected. And it's not that I or the people I work with don't believe in the nation state. We absolutely need to make collective decisions at a national level. What I have seen everywhere we work, from Maryland and Delaware and DC and Virginia, like this part of the United States, to Sierra Leone, to India, is that communities can build from grassroots struggles related to environmental harms or other injustices that they're facing. They can build from those, draw on the learning that emerges from those struggles and the leadership that emerges from those struggles to envision and win fundamental changes in laws and systems that affect entire states or entire nations. I totally agree with the point that Vij made and that one of the speakers made, that like these rights problems, they appear with renewables as well. It's not like they're specific to a certain kind of industry. And we do have really, and that points to the fact we've got really, really tough decisions to make, and we're going to have to come to solutions both at a local level and at a national level and at an international level. I think that the point that I would sort of end on or hang my hat on is that in making those decisions, if we can honor the voices and the leadership of the people who have experienced the brunt of the harms, and if we can democratize our decision making so that those voices actually count in a way that they haven't historically, then we will get to better decisions, ones that are more equitable and more tenable from an environmental perspective. Not that it won't be messy, as Vij says, but there'll be better decisions.
Great. Thank you very much, Vivek, Gyude. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.